Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to make a start. So if you're grabbing some last food and drink and then want to find a seat, and then we'll start. Come on, Rima. And we'll make a start. I'll give you 1 minute. Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I think we're going to make a start. So first of all, just a huge thank you for coming. We recognize it's been a long 2 weeks and this is coming at the end of it. But we have food and drink, we have teas and coffees, so please help yourselves. As you can see, keep your energy levels up. It's going to be a really good event. So just to introduce myself, for anyone that hasn't met me, my name is Jack Collier. I head up our marine and species conservation team within DEFRA and UK government, and we support the UK Management Authority on Marine Species. Also, just a big thank you to the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries and to RECOM. In collaboration with CITES, one of our UK government organisations, we're doing lots of work at the moment to look at sustainable trade, tackling illegal wildlife trade in sharks and rays, and so this is a really welcome event. Just a couple of logistics. Hopefully some of you will have already seen the kind of information available about the event. But to summarize, the focus of today is really going to be about habitat quality. So why is that relevant for CITES? How do we, or how should we be integrating that into our implementation of the convention? And what are some of the kind of best practice, tips, tools, methods that we can be looking at to kind of integrate it into our practice? So in terms of the agenda, it's fairly straightforward. Hopefully, I'm not going to be doing too much talking. You're actually going to be hearing from our 3 fabulous speakers. We have 3 expert speakers who will be delivering presentations. Following that, we then have a brief panel discussion, and then we will open up to the floor for questions and comments for you guys. But first, we're very fortunate to be joined by Mr. Samin Tahadi, who is the Director of Species and Genetic Conservation at the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, who will be giving us some kind of opening remarks to kick us off. So, Mr. Samin Tahadi, please.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Good evening, everyone. First time I want to say thank you for all to join us in the side event. And secondly, I want to say thank you for team to prepare the side event. Thank you also for the government of UK for the support. Thank you, Yayasan Rekam. Excellency, distinguished delegate, colleagues, and partner. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you in this side event, Habitat Quality at CITES. We truly appreciate your presence and engagement in this important discussion. Healthy and resilient habitat are the foundation for ensuring the long-term survival of the cited listed species. The global pressure on ecosystem continue to grow, strengthening the integration of habitat quality into species management is more critical than ever. Today's session brings together experts, policymakers, and practitioners to share insight, experience, and approaches to improving habitat conditions, both within and beyond protected area. CITES play a critical role in ensuring that international trade in wild species is legal, traceable, and sustainability. A core tool in through the development on non-detrimental finding. However, many NDF and trade management decisions focus narrowly on population metric, overlooking the fundamental importance of habitat condition. Increasingly, it is evident that the long-term sustainability of species and trade depend not only on controlling optic level, but also on the conservation, restoration, and protection of their habitat. This side event will explore the critical link between international trade, species sustainability, and habitat integrity, aligning with the broader goal of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. In the growing recognition within CITES of the need for systemic approaches to wildlife trade regulation. We hope this event will serve as a platform to explore practical solutions, enhance collaboration among parties, and support the implementation of CITES through stronger ecosystem-based conservation action. Thank you once again for joining us. I wish us all a productive and inspiring discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Samin Tahadi. And now we have the first of our presentations from Ahmad Sofi Ullah from the Indonesian Management Authority, and this is looking at protecting corals.
Do I have to stand or not?
You can do whatever you want.
Do whatever you want. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. My name is Ahmad. I'm from the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, Republic of Indonesia. Today's I will share not really expertise, but actually several experience as we are the policymakers in the coral protection. Next slide, please. I will only have 10 minutes. Okay, so I will start off with the our minister agenda in Blue Economy pillars, which is one of the pillar is protecting the ocean. We have 5 main agenda, and the first agenda is expansion of marine protected areas. So we in long term agenda, we will contribute to 30% of marine protection. And this align with the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, though we will plan to have the 30% protection of our marine area in 2045, not in 2030. This is because we adjust our interest, our capacity as well, and also the national agenda. So yeah, next slide. Okay, we have lots of aquatic species in CITES, one of which is corals. We have lots of corals listed in the Appendix 2, and we still trade them. It's important for the welfare of our people, and also we have to manage it through for the sustainability purpose. Next slide. So these slides actually just want to show that how significant our marine area in the sense of we are in the heart of the coral triangle area, where hundreds of species of corals that also it is significant to protect our waters. Then I can say that it has a significant role in the ecosystem of the world's ocean. Next slide. Yeah, this is I want to share my views that CITES provides a critical international legal framework to prevent over exploitation through trade. But this framework is better or most effective when the natural condition or the habitats necessary for the species being traded are also secured. I mean, CITES is a key tools in maintaining the sustainability, but CITES positions actually in the downstream. We also need to consider the upstream, the healthy of the habitats, the healthy of the home of the species we are trading. Next slide. For Indonesia, we are protecting the coral reef through a policy, we call it the National Action Plan. We have developed the document, and we have 5 targets, one of which is through the protection and preservation of the habitats. This key target, the protecting and preserving the habitats, we do it through two key policy. The first one is through the MPA establishment, which I mentioned earlier that we plan to have 30% by 2045 of our water is protected or declared as the marine protected area. And the second one, we also have, apart from that top-down approach, we also have a coral stock center development initiative. So we protect the habitat of the corals through these 2 key strategies. Next slide. Well, for the MPA expansion, we now have 29.9 million hectares of MPA as per last year, 2024, and this cover 9.2% of our waters. So it's a long way to go to until 30%, but as I mentioned also earlier, that this target will be achieved in 2045. And the current situation is that approximately 40% of the coral reefs habitat is part of this marine protected area. Next, I think this slide is just to emphasize that protecting coral reef through development of MPAs have several benefits. I don't have to explain it deeper. I think many experts already understand that the marine protected area will reduce overfishing, protect coral habitats, and improve water quality, and also support the ecosystem resilience. Next slides. Yeah, this is also just to be part of the discussion that we have several evidence, even many evidence, scientific evidence showing that no-take zones improve both coral cover and biodiversity of the ocean. Yeah, we can just Google it, and tons of scientific resource already there. Next slide. Yeah. This is the current MPA location we have in Indonesia. We have hundreds of marine protected area spanning from the west part of Indonesia in Sumatra until the eastern part in Papua. Next slide. Yeah, the MPA we are managing is actually we measure the effectiveness of the MPA through a tools called the EFICA. It is a national tool to evaluate how far we have managed, how well we are managing the marine protected area. It has 3 levels from gold, bronze until gold, silver, and bronze. So it has 3 levels, and the latest evaluation tools, the latest evaluation of EFICA show that we are. I'm not saying that we are in a good, but we are on track in managing our MPA towards better management. Next slide. Okay, this is about the Coral Stock Center. We also have initiative called Coral Stock Center Development. So the center is actually initiative from stakeholders, not only from the government, like we are developing the marine protected area, but Coral Stock Center plays a critical role in involving in engagement with community, with stakeholders, not only from the government, in protecting particular habitat, particular area, not in a manner of marine protected area, but we do the rehabilitation, we do protection of the habitat with the community and other stakeholders. The center plays critical role in safeguarding coral diversity, maintaining ex situ coral stock as backup for natural reefs we have. Yeah, this also maps that shows several area of the initiatives of the coral stock centers. Some are in Sumatra Island, and some are in Java, Kalimantan, and also in Papua. Yeah, next slide. This is the interesting part that we are managing our vast oceans. We have lots of challenges, though we also have support from many parties, from NGOs, but still we have lacking management capacity. We still need funding, because managing marine protected area, we need funding. It's like we have home. We won't neglect that home. We need resources to manage that home, for paying bills, for paying electricity, so on and so forth. So yeah, we need to have innovative funding. And we also have we have also limit in monitoring the protected area, the ocean that we are protecting. The vast area, and sometimes it's remote area, so it's not easy, guys, for protecting our waters. And also we have pressure with other stakeholders. There are development in the coastal area, pollution, development of factory, and yeah, for the interest of economy, sometimes we have to compromise with them. Next slide. Yeah, this is also to inform our initiative, ongoing initiative to foster coral reef management. Currently, we are with the United States government. We have a Debt for Nature swap. Under the Tropical Forest Coral Reef Conservation Act. So we are not receiving fund actually, but we have debt to the US government, and then we pay that debt, and that money goes back for the coral reef conservation. Now we are in the stage of development, and the first cycle of the grants, it's actually in the form of grants given to the local community, local NGOs that have initiative to protect or conserve coral reefs across Indonesia. In particular, Debt for Nature swap priority area is in the Coral Triangle area I mentioned earlier, I showed you earlier. And we also have the second initiative is the Coral Reef Insurance. This is also part of the our initiative with NGOs. We are supported by many NGOs like Conservation Indonesia, and also from Samarkand Nusantara. We are now piloting this Coral Reef Insurance into marine protected area in Nusa Penida, in Bali. You must already have heard about Bali, of course. And the second one is in Lombok, Nusa Tenggara, West Nusa Tenggara. So the third one, we also engage with the private sectors, like recent National Marine Protected Area Anambas. We also have a MOU signing with them, with the Medco Energy. It is oil and gas company that have responsibility also to look after our ocean. And the last one, we also filling the gap of funding through alternative funding, like we we submit lots of proposal of to the GF and other source of funding. I think I will leave it to that, and we'll be happy to discuss with you all. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jack.
Thank you, Ahmed. Really interesting to hear that kind of upstream picture, as you called it, on managing habitat. I'm sure people have lots of questions. If you can save them till the end, then we'll take everything together. But our next speaker is the wonderful Jules McAlpine with something very non-controversial. He's going to be talking about eels. So moving on from that upstream picture, now we're looking at more about how do we integrate habitat considerations into CITES processes like making NDFs. Thank you, Jules.
Yeah, thank you. Upstream and downstream, I guess, and thank you for that very interesting talk on corals. So my name is Jules McAlpine. I work for the UK CITES Scientific Authority, and I'm going to talk about how we tried to incorporate habitat considerations into our non-detriment finding for European eel, which wasn't easy, and you'll probably see as it goes on that I'm not sure we have actually managed this successfully. But the eel, it's critically endangered species since 2008. It's been listed in CITES since 2009 following decisions at COP in 2014 and on CMS Appendix 2 as well. So with eels, it's very complex because ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, continues to advise for no take for any purpose, and it also considers that all non-fisheries related anthropogenic mortalities should be reduced to zero, and importantly the quantity and quality of eel habitats should be restored. Fundamentally for us, our NDF, when we were trying to look at habitat and incorporate risks, we didn't really necessarily develop new data, but we incorporated it from eel management plan data, which we're obliged to undertake. And so eel management plans, they aim to recover the species. So the eel regulation, which has been, it's an EU regulation, but it's been transposed into UK law, states that eel management plans must be prepared for all river basin districts that contain habitats that are suitable for European eel. So the main thrust of the eel regulation is aimed at increasing production and escapement of eels. So the core long-term aims of an EMP is to reduce these anthropogenic mortalities to permit escapement to the sea. We were aiming for 40%, or at least 40% of silver eel biomass relative to pristine or unexploited conditions, and actually trying to understand what is pristine is really difficult for our river systems. So EMPs, they must identify the measures needed to achieve the escapement goal, which may include reducing fishing mortality, improving migratory pathways, which is really critical here, restoring habitat, restocking, and reducing any other sort of mortalities. And these are developed at an RBD, or River Basin District scale, because obviously eel recovery requires these sort of catchment-wide coordination. Our NDF was developed in response really to leaving the EU. Our trade was mainly with EU partners for restocking and aquaculture purposes, but on leaving the EU we needed to develop an NDF, ideally to maintain that trade, but we haven't been able to achieve that with zero quotas and import suspensions, and it's been more formally recognised with the eel going onto the EU suspensions regulation. So we can no longer trade with the EU. So our NDF is now looking basically more globally. Next slide, please. And so talking about the NDF, ICES again recommends that NDFs are made at the level of the full stock. And our NDF provides evidence that positive NDF can be made at smaller spatial scales, and it's something that is constantly debated in sort of the eel world. So our overarching NDF concludes that controlled trade is sustainable from only two main fisheries, and that's live glass eels from the rivers Severn and Parrot, which are in southwest England, and yellow and silver eels from Loch Ness in Northern Ireland. I'm going to talk more about the rivers Severn and Parrot, but really happy to talk about Loch Ness as well later, because I think they're very different, and I can see some eel experts here, so it's a really interesting story. But yeah, so the glass eel fisheries were assessed using a really highly precautionary approach, recognizing all the inherent uncertainties in relation to species information and also information on modeling the data which came from the EMPs. We've also developed additional safeguards to restrict levels and purposes of trade to ensure that non-detriment continues to be achieved through the chain, through the supply chain, and to try and deter illegal trade. And yeah, we recognize regarding sort of restocking, because that's what our eels are primarily for. The glass eels go to restock other river systems. There's a healthy discussion to be had about the value or not of reintroductions, and particularly into different and often far-flung river systems. So I'm going to talk about surplus, and while eels from donor rivers may have surpluses, from a species perspective, it's important to acknowledge that the removal may affect the eel population structure, such as sex ratios, and the broader freshwater ecosystem. So as I said, for our NDF, there was a highly precautionary approach taken, and in the UK, we identified 8 rivers where recruitment levels exceeded the estimated carrying capacity. If you click here, I think we might... Yeah, an amazing graphic there from Becky Austin, who's in the room. So this analysis using sort of mean catch rates from 2015 to 2017 suggested that surpluses were available in those 8 rivers, but only in substantial quantities from 2, and that is the Severn and the Parrot, which you can see on that graphic. So for the Severn, glass eel recruitment exceeds carrying capacity, creating a surplus that would have died otherwise. So density-dependent mortality, there's a real funneling that goes along the Bristol Channel. And so the NDF considered these can be exploited by the fishery without detriment to silver eel production. So this is, as I said, debated. Dead glass eels are not no use to an ecosystem, of course. In the case of Loch Ness, we've found that stocking there from the Severn, it's more provable that it's not only sustainable, it can actually provide a conservation benefit by increasing the production and associated escapement of silver eels above that would have occurred sort of without those fisheries-related interventions. Next slide, please. So you're talking about trying to incorporate habitat and looking at how to assess. I think barriers is probably the most important thing, and how to account for them and account for their mitigation. So across England and Wales, there are about 19,000 potential barriers, and these are partial and complete to eel migration. And sort of river fragmentation through man-made barriers prevent fish from migrating upstream or downstream and affecting the quality or availability of the habitat. And I think this graphic gives quite a good idea of the extent of barriers that there are evidence. And taking the Severn as an example, where the majority of glass eels are harvested, major barriers have been in place since the 1800s. So the river's been extensively managed to control flooding, and particularly in the lower tidal reaches. And also there's areas where it's been reclaimed for. So it's very difficult to get a baseline of what pristine might look like in these sort of environments. And these barriers restrict migratory species, and that's European eel, it could be salmon, lamprey, from reaching upstream, spawning for some or feeding grounds. And in transitional and fresh waters, barriers can be a major non-fishing anthropogenic threat. And these also include habitat alteration, deterioration of water quality, the presence of non-native diseases or parasites, and all these contribute to the anthropogenic stresses and mortality on eels and affect their, essentially and eventually, their reproductive success. And we found that eels tend to have greater mortality rates from downstream passage at hydropower stations than other fish species. So pumping stations can cause damage and direct or delayed mortality in fish when they're passing through the pumps, or delays in fish passage that may increase rates of fishing pressure, predation, or disease. So eels can get caught up in cooling water intake flows and screens really at any stage in their life. So the UK, going back to the eel management plan, has chosen to focus its efforts on eel conservation and removing barriers to migration or making them accessible, trying to mitigate for them, and trying to avoid those mortalities at intakes and to power stations, etc. And really, sort of that, I think, talking about habitat, that's absolutely key, that improving river continuity and removing or mitigating barriers is absolutely key for these fish and the overall health of river ecosystems. Yeah, next slide, please. So this is the final slide. How did we assess? Well, it was really difficult. We tried to account for it, but it's not, as I was talking earlier, it's not very easy to assess what a pristine baseline looks like for this river system. For the EMP reports, the lack of information regarding the relative effects of these potential impacts on migration and production. So neither were really incorporated into the models that we used. Rather, the productive area of the catchment under what you might call pristine conditions was reduced by 2/3 in order to model the sort of combined effects of eel production, of barriers, and of habitat quality. And as I said earlier, we didn't use new data specific to the development of the NDF. It incorporated existing data from these EMP reports, and these continue to be developed, and there's been another one subsequently released which does show that there have been improvements, if you call them improvements, like more mitigation for barriers, reduced fishing effort, but is that contributing to increased escapement? That's something we're not sure about. So with the NDF, we used necessarily an adaptive approach for the River Severn. The impact of barriers was modelled across the river basin district. And we had probably less certainty with this one compared to the Parrot, which used a more detailed local spatial data that enabled a more accurate assessment of accessible habitat. So these models that we relied heavily upon, they also relied heavily upon assumptions and lots of parameters about eel life biology. Some of the assumptions we had, I think we thought were quite good, such as the number of glass eels per kg, maturation rates, but others were less so. And one is, of course, the pristine production rate that I've talked about, settlement mortality, and particularly when applied at the river basin district level, as there are so many different types of habitat types, and also the quality varies. So yeah, so whilst identifying the accessible habitat from barriers might be straightforward, modelling the impacts is really difficult. And I think some of these discussions will be really interesting about how to develop NDFs and incorporate these habitat considerations. So yeah, with all these uncertainties, there's no strict sort of science-based threshold that we could arrive at to account for these barriers or other anthropogenic threats, and including the fishery. So we started with an assumption that the fishery is 100% efficient, which means the exploitation is 100%, which means no glass eels are going through the fisheries. That's extremely precautious, because if that was true, there'd be no yellow eel production upstream. And suggestions are that it's considerably less, perhaps 16% in the Severn, and the mean range of exploitation varies in reports from about 4% up to 36%. So to retain sufficient precaution, and we call our NDF highly precautionary, and yet recognise that natural recruitment is taking place. We put a deliberate, very precautionary 75% exploitation rate applied to the NDF to balance some of the inherent uncertainties. So what we're saying is that 70% of glass eels are caught, which means 25% are getting through the fishery and then trying to reach sort of carrier capacity. And that is highly precautionary and very unlikely that it's as limited as that. Unfortunately, the Severn River Basin District is actually failing to reach that escapement target of 40%, and we've concluded that closing the glass eel fishery, though, without increasing the amount of habitat or improving access is likely to result in just an increase in density-dependent mortality in the estuary and lower reaches of the rivers, but actually have no long-term increase in silver eel output. And I think that's really important when we're considering whether an NDF can be made. And our NDF gets reviewed every 3 years, and it's being reviewed next year. And some of these issues and hopefully these discussions we're going to think about and take away with us, and how we can incorporate them better into the NDF. But yeah, at the end of this, I'm sorry to say we're not sure how to account for habitat quality, but it is absolutely key and vital. Thank you.
Thank you, Jules. I think really helpful to hear some of those honest reflections on the challenges of considering habitat. We will probably be coming back to that as a theme later on in our panel discussion, the challenges, so you will have to have figured out how to address those challenges by the time we have the discussion. So our final speaker is Dr. Rima Jabado. Many of you know Rima. She wears many hats, but I suppose specifically just to say she is the chair of the IUCN Shark Specialist Group and the deputy chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission.
I'm going to sit so I can see the screen, but good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all, and thank you for having me. How many of you have actually ever been in the water and been lucky enough to see something like this? Can I see a show of hands? 1, 2, that's it? Not many. Well, you're missing out on something incredible. And what we are trying to do is map all of these areas around the world. Because, as you know, we have a problem when it comes to shark and rays. We are seeing massive declines in their populations around the world, whether it's the pelagic species, whether it's the coral reef-associated species, and we're at the point where they're the second most threatened group of vertebrates around the world. And that's primarily because they're a fisheries commodity instead of being seen as wildlife. And this is something that you see along the coasts around the world in so many places. So imagine that this is one day at my field sites, and you would go around the world, around the coastal areas, and this is what's happening everywhere. And we know that overfishing is the core problem, but the second core problem is that they're also losing the habitats that they depend on. They're losing the habitats because we're still fishing in those habitats, trawling as an example, where we're really destroying the benthic ecosystems, but also we're changing the functioning of those habitats because we're removing the species that were occupying them. And so we saw an opportunity with the Global Biodiversity Framework, and particularly Target 4, which is about reducing biodiversity loss, but especially Target 3, which looks at protecting all of our waters, let's say inland and marine waters, by 2030. And this is what we call Target 3. And we really wanted to make sure that governments had the right information available when they're making decisions of where to protect, because it's not about a number and reaching 30%, it's about making sure that we're protecting the right habitat for the species that we want to conserve. And for sharks and rays, we simply did not have that information. And so we also have an opportunity with the High Seas Treaty that's coming into force on January 17th. As many of you know, that also means that we have provisions for protected areas in the high seas, but we also have provisions for environmental impact assessments in the high seas to make sure that any further exploration does not impact the species that occur there. And so the Important Shark and Ray Areas project is the first expert-driven classification of habitats that have the potential to be delineated and managed for conservation. They complement other processes that you might have heard of, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity process, the ecologically and biologically significant marine areas, the EPSAs, or the KBAs, the key biodiversity areas. They support the creation of what I call the right MPAs for sharks, rays, and chimeras around the world, but also the creation of networks across the ocean that represent ecological connectivity. And once we start incorporating these areas into proper conservation planning processes, that's when we can actually reduce mortality for sharks and rays. And again, we're working through CITES. It's an excellent process because, as you know, a lot of the fishing is trade-driven. We're working through CMS for migratory species, but we also need to start looking a little bit more about how do we protect some of those critical habitats that have been identified around the world. And right now, we've seen this global MPA trend, a trend that's growing very quickly. Countries are declaring huge expanses of their exclusive economic zones as MPAs, but at the current trend, we're not going to reach our 30 by 30 goal. Where we are right now is actually only still less than 10% of the ocean that is protected, and we were meant to have reached that quite a few years ago, but only less than 3% is actually currently considered fully protected. That means even in the areas that we have protected, we still allow fishing, which means that we still allow mortality for many of the species that we're trying to protect. And what we need to be starting to think of is how do we make sure that we can reduce mortality in those areas that we're calling marine protected. And so we developed the ISRA criteria, which are relevant to the ecology and biology of the species. I'm not going to go through all of these, but essentially what we're looking to map are areas that are very important for range-restricted species, endemics, for example, areas that are important for reproduction, for aggregation, or for movement. And we're going around the world to do this, and what we've defined it as is discrete three-dimensional areas that are important for one or more species and that have the potential to be managed for conservation. And three-dimensional is really important here because, as you'll have heard from the gulper sharks, they don't occur in very shallow waters. So you can actually put protected areas or fisheries management measures in the water column, so between 300 and 700 meters, for example, and be able to protect a habitat that is important for a deep water species. So where we are now is we've mapped critical habitats for sharks and rays in over 70% of the ocean. The areas that are grayed out on the map are the areas that we're hoping to finalize by the end of next year, because we want to have the final map ready by 2027, where governments will meet again at the Marine Protected Areas Congress. And some of you may have heard Panama is also hosting the World Protected Areas Congress. So quite a lot of meetings in 2027, bringing together governments and stakeholders to try and understand where is going to be the big push to reach that 30%. And where we are now is we've delineated 816 areas that we consider are critically important for these species, and we've covered almost half of the diversity of sharks, rays, and chimeras around the world. So there are obviously species that don't have enough information for us to be able to delineate these habitats, but I think we've done pretty well in terms of trying to get this information. And we're compiling for each region that we're going to a compendium, and this is a country-by-country summary of the areas that have been identified with maps and information on the species and the criteria that are met in those areas. And this is the last one that we've just finished, the European Atlantic region, but we hope to finish Australia and the Southeast Indian Ocean by January to try and make sure that that whole region is also covered. To do this, we've really reached out very, very broadly. We've had over workshops in every single region that we have. We've had 10 workshops so far, but we've had over 1,400 contributors, experts from around the world that have been willing to give us their data, often unpublished, often unavailable anywhere else, just so that they can make sure that they're contributing to this process. We've worked also through the Convention on Migratory Species to make sure that some of this is integrated into the decisions, both the CMS Convention and its daughter agreement, the Sharks Memorandum of Understanding. And the decisions there were that parties would support the implementation of the ISRA initiative, that they would consider the areas that are delineated as part of the process in their marine spatial planning processes. And just a plug here for a document that's going to be released at the CMS COP in March next year. And it essentially covers all of the ISRA's 4 migratory sharks and rays that are listed on CMS, but there are 42 species, and I think 40 of them are CITES listed species. So obviously there's quite a lot of overlap there in terms of the information that can be extracted from this document. And we've been working with the Key Biodiversity Area Secretariat and the Convention on Biological Diversity to also see where the overlaps are between some of those areas and what documentation is needed to make sure that these areas also have a recognition under a different label. In the last 2 years of the project, we've had over 400 requests for the spatial layers from governments, from universities doing research, from consultancies doing environmental impact assessments, and so very big uptake very, very quickly, which is very promising because we want to make sure that all of this information is freely available to everybody to be able to use it in their marine spatial planning. And I want to zoom in a little bit now into Asia because we've been doing some analyses from each of the regions that we've been tackling. And so for the Asia region, what we tried to do is obviously identify the species that were used to delineate the ISRAs and what criteria were applied. We examined the overlap between ISRAs and MPAs, both take MPAs, so partial MPAs, and no-take MPAs, and we looked at the data types and the methods that we use for the ISRA delineation. And I'm just going to focus on the second point there in terms of MPAs and overlap. But this is what the map looks like for what we define as the Asia region, which goes all the way up to Russia, but includes the east coast of India and down to Indonesia. And we had 122 areas across 12 jurisdictions, and the ISRAs cover about 3% of the region, and they're the areas that are in that coral pink on the map. You see some large ones there, and those are movement areas for whale sharks primarily, but also for some of the manta rays. We identified major gaps. There were no ISRAs identified in 8 jurisdictions, and these are the jurisdictions with the highest level of fishing pressure, the ones that have been exploiting sharks and rays for a very long time. And you can see on the map here we have Cambodia, Vietnam, and all the way up to China. China doesn't have a lot of research on sharks and rays that could help us meet the ISRA criteria, but the other countries did, but there was simply no habitat that was left intact enough for us to be able to delineate any habitats. But then we looked at the other countries in the region, and we found that MPAs still overall cover less than 5% of the EEZs across the 14 jurisdictions. 9 of these have less than 1% of their waters covered by MPAs, so very, very low levels there. And you can see on that graph on the side which countries have no-take MPAs versus MPAs overall, and Bangladesh and Japan are the countries that reach about 7% of their waters as MPAs, but all of the others have very little or none at all if you're looking at India, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and Brunei. You also, when we looked at the overlap between the areas that were identified as ISRAs versus also those MPAs, only 5% of the total ISRA areas were covered by an MPA. That means that pretty much all of the critical habitats that we identified for sharks, rays, and chimeras did not have any type of protection. And 2.8 overlapped only with no-take MPAs, and those no-take MPAs obviously are the hope for that region, but as we're looking into this a little bit more, this is what it looks like when we zoom into Asia. There are a lot of large areas, those are the movement areas that show connectivity, but there are also a lot of very small areas that have the potential to be managed and that have the potential to make a difference for a lot of these species. Many of them in Asia and Indonesia in particular, are relevant to CITES listed species, so a huge opportunity to use some of the CITES listings alongside this process to be able to understand what are the habitats that should be conserved and how we can make a big push towards that as we move forward towards 2030. Just want to say that this is funded by the Shark Conservation Fund and the German government, so thanks to them for all of their support to put this together. And thank you all.
Thank you, Rima. Huge amount of work going into the ISRAs there, and such a useful tool for people. You will have seen that I've moved over here. That's because we're moving to the panel discussion, and I want to get out of the way so that these guys can discuss. I'm going to tee you up with a fairly soft one to start with, and then we'll get to some of the trickier questions. So why does habitat quality matter? Why don't we just use blunter measures purely around abundance estimates, declines, things like that? Like why is it worth considering when we're looking at CITES processes? Feel free to jump in, anyone, otherwise I will pick on someone.
Maybe just broadly, because sustainability is not just about how many animals we're removing from the water, it's also about the habitats that support the different life history processes for these species. So reproductive areas, areas where they're feeding, that they're resting. In many cases, we're seeing that shark and ray species come back to the same habitat. So a female will come back. I'll give an example. In the Bahamas, lemon sharks are famous in some of the mangrove areas there, and the female gives birth there, disappears for about 2 years. The pups use it as a nursery ground, and the same females come back there every 2 years to give birth. And they use that exact same habitat for very long periods of time, which means that if we remove some of those habitats, we're directly impacting the core habitats that these species need to use. And yeah, that's just one really important consideration for these species, but it's relevant for turtles, it's relevant for cetaceans, and for many of the other marine megafauna for which we have information.
Yeah, I think for eels, you know, they've got very complex life histories, and transboundary, transnational, they're sort of transatlantic migration. So accounting for habitat, of course, is very difficult, but it's so important all through their sort of life history. But talking about why don't we account for it, we found with eels it's so difficult. So those proxies on abundance and fisheries effort are really what we, and also available habitat are really what we've got to use at the moment. But yeah, I'm really hoping that actually people can engage in this discussion and try and give us some ideas for when we develop the NDF going forward of how we can perhaps better account for habitat, or even if it's possible, because we struggle, which is why, like I said, it's just very highly precautionary.
Thank you. From my perspective, the protecting habitat meaning that we are protecting the home. It is the foundation for any species survival, and the current tools in the CITES is we have NDF, and how we better improve our NDF. We are not only relying on the number of population and also the harvest level. Perhaps we can also incorporate other indicators like climate change, pollution, land use change, so on and so forth. So we hope that habitat or their home indicators can also be incorporated in NDF development in the future. Thank you.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because one problem we have is looking at the sort of spatial scales. NDFs are made sort of almost like a snapshot, whereas these spatial scales, if you're trying to account for habitat quality or climate change, they're on completely different spatial scales, so accounting for them is very complex. I'm not sure we could actually make a negative NDF based solely on climate change impacts, for example. It'd be very difficult.
And just picking up on that, so we've heard some of the challenges around data availability, around dealing with spatiotemporal scales being difficult as well. Are there any other challenges that are worth highlighting when we're thinking about how we integrate habitat considerations into CITES processes?
And I can see Matt Gollock in the room, and we have in the UK ZSL, who Matt works for, chair the UK Eel Forum, which has been really, really helpful to get information. But and one of the discussions we're having is talking about reintroductions and the value, or I mentioned it, or not, of reintroductions. And we're looking at seas live eels and their reintroductions as well. And perhaps, sorry Matt, I don't want to throw you under the bus here, but talk, your opinions on whether or not reintroductions are actually helpful. Because when we're making NDFs, we do have these safeguards in place, and we want to make sure actually that the sustainability, but also the purpose is right, and and so actually, if reintroductions are not effective, that's obviously going to impact also how we make our decision making.
Yeah, if I may, from my perspective, the key challenge is dealing with other sector. I think we are protecting natural habitats for the species, but we also have to compromise with the other sectors target. They have when we're protecting one space, then maybe there are other sectors that have interest in that area. Though it is important, let's say, shark and race area, we have to compromise with other sectors. That's where discussion, dialogue are needed. Thank you.
I think there are three main challenges that we've seen. One that you mentioned already, Jack, was data availability. Obviously, a lot of the fisheries information for sharks and rays comes from regional fisheries management organization or national authorities. And getting access to those data sets is extremely difficult, if not impossible in some cases, and that does limit the ability to identify areas in some locations where fisheries are intense. The second one is, even if the data are available, there's sometimes very little capacity to be able to analyze it in the way that is needed for us to be able to delineate critical habitats. And I think that, that's something that needs to be worked on increasingly, clearer guidance, shared tools, and capacity transfer in many cases to be able to make sure that the data are being used the right way. And the third one is boundaries. Sharks and rays move. And although we would like to protect discrete habitat, jurisdictional issues are a huge problem. And I showed on the map some areas of the whale sharks that are quite large. Their movements, they're crossing multiple jurisdictions and areas beyond national jurisdiction. So taking any action to try and protect some of those habitats is right now probably impossible in many regions of the world.
So Rima, you've actually predicted my next question, so this might be a little bit redundant now, but so we've heard about ISRAS as a potential tool. Jules, you talked about eel management plans being a source of information, as well as ICES advice. Of course, we have things like RFMO, stock assessments at a species level. What other resources and tools are available to help parties when they're trying to consider habitat? And are there any examples of best practice from other MEAs, national practices, any other organizations that are good to learn from?
I think we've got quite a good idea of, in the UK, in the eel management plan, of the available habitat, the barriers that are preventing access for eels to perhaps get to some of this available habitat, and trying to put in place things to mitigate for that. So I think, for a river system, it's perhaps easier to model and establish, to establish what habitat is available and what isn't, whereas I can understand for, in the ocean, it's very difficult. And of course, with eels, we're only considering it when they reach our estuaries. We're not considering the habitat beforehand, and I don't know how we can, to be honest.
Yeah, in national level, actually, it's countries. If it's about jurisdictional area, I think we can also consider the marine spatial planning tools to better protect our habitat for the CITES listed species.
I think I mentioned a little bit, but one thing that we do struggle with a lot is also appropriate mapping of habitats. When we did the Pacific region, we didn't even have bathymetry layers that were appropriate for the work that we were doing, and often even the governments there don't have them. So you have huge expanses of water where we don't know what habitat is there, we don't know the depth layers, and They're tools that are becoming increasingly available at a better resolution, but they're still tools that we need if we want to do a better job at mapping and putting appropriate boundaries around areas that we think are important.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I could sit here and ask you questions all day, but I think it might be nice to open up to the floor. Are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? Matt, you've obviously already been called out by Jules. So if you'd like to kick us off, and then I think we have a question down the front as well. There should be mics going around. Yeah.
Hi, Matt Golick from ZSL, under the bus from Jules. Your point about reintroductions was making me think about if we can't necessarily assess habitat quality or incorporate that into NDFs. I was sort of thinking, like, what proxies do we have? And for me, at least in the context of eels, if you have good quality habitat, you would have good quality escaping fish. So should we be looking at things like, pollutant load, condition factor, that sort of thing to give us, I guess, sort of a sense of whether we're producing good spawners? Because I think we rely very much on quantity at the moment. It's like we know that we've got X amount leaving, but is that X any good? Because if it's not, then, and that I think I would imagine would reflect to some extent whether you've got good habitat quality or not. So, I mean, I don't know how easy that would be for sharks, but maybe for corals it would be slightly easier. But I guess that was, and with reintroductions, if you put them into bad habitat, you're going to get bad spawners. So I think there's a question in there, but anyway.
Thanks, Matt. And I do realise I did throw you under the bus, but I think absolutely, and going to Rima's point about data, the data we have, as we've got a number of the fisheries in the UK have closed or are facing managed decline, which actually means we're getting less data on what's coming into the rivers and what's escaping, which does confound actually the making of NDFs and actually the accuracy of our sort of decision making in a way, and it then points to us just having to be highly precautionary, but without perhaps a firm stance in actually the science in a way. So we're actually getting less information at the moment. But I think, yeah, absolutely, Matt's point about being able to assess the quality of the specimens that are escaping is really important.
Thank you. I think we have a question down the front.
Thank you. Sonia Fordham, Shark Advocates International. Thank you for putting this together and for all your presentations. As you might imagine, my question is for Dr. Chivato. So obviously you have a good part of the world left to do, and you covered, I think, very well the challenges and the data limitations and so forth. But I'm just wondering if in the work you've done so far, if there's anything that surprised you in a good way. And I was thinking maybe you talked about, highly migratory species being a challenge, but maybe a highly migratory threatened species where you found a habitat that could actually have a lot of bang for the buck if it were protected, or maybe something like the highly threatened rhino rays where you found a habitat that hasn't yet been destroyed and there might be potential to protect that. I'm just curious, or anything in between, just looking for something that's jumped out at you. Thanks.
Thanks, Sonia. Good question. Oh, so many things. I love this process. I feel like I'm learning something new every day about the species. You read about the ecology and the biology, and you assume that a species is associated with a certain habitat, and then when we start pulling together this information, we're actually realizing that often it's a little bit different than what we thought. I'll stick to CITES listed species and scalloped hammerheads and seamounts. a huge amount of areas that have been identified for aggregations of scalloped hammerheads have been offshore seamounts. And I think that in particular is appearing to be a very important habitat. We often don't know where they go between them, but in some areas like the Eastern Tropical Pacific where they've done a little bit more tagging, we're clearly seeing them just jump from one seamount to the other and aggregating there, although they separate between those seamounts. So something's happening there. The rhino rays we're finding in deeper waters than we thought. And that is surprising because we often just say that they're coastal species and they occur in waters less than 100 meters, but we're finding some of them actually do extend into much deeper water, and we have the evidence to now show that. So yeah, a lot of species, we're changing the known depth range, we're changing the habitat that we thought that they were associated, we're doing range expansions, so some very interesting things that are coming up, and it's something that we're trying to do as a final paper that will come out of this, is what are some of those things that we've picked up that are different for the species than what we think scientifically we knew. Yeah.
Thank you, Rima, and thank you, Sonia. And sorry, I should have said, if you're asking a question, if you could just introduce yourself and your organization, that would be great. Yes, a question at the back, please.
Thank you. My name is Jihad. I'm from Burung Indonesia, BirdLife International Partners in Indonesia. Actually, we have a currently working on the KBAs actually in Wallacea hotspot, and I was already looking at the ISRA database, and there's some questions like, is there any minimal areas for ISRA that's being identified? Because I see like there's a very small areas and very large area, like in the Lesser Sunda waters. And the second is how will your future strategy to incorporate this or to encourage parties to use these tools as a basis for their future shark and ray conservation management? Thank you.
Thank you. So for the KBAs, just so that you know, we also have a paper that was just recently published that looked at which ISRAs can actually automatically be proposed as KBAs. The criteria are quite different because the KBAs were developed primarily for terrestrial species, and it's very different with what happens in the ocean, but we have found that some areas can be transferred into KBAs. There are some very small areas that you don't see on the map. I recommend zooming on them. We put a boundary around the data points, and there may be other areas that are important around them, but if there is no information, we can't map those areas or we can't extend the boundaries beyond that. For your second question, which is integration and policy, we hope that everybody takes it forward. We are trying to be the data providers, and we are obviously encouraging governments at different events around the world to make sure that they know about the process, but the information is freely available. We have acknowledged all of the contributors to every single area that are usually national experts, so that governments within their own countries can also contact the experts that contributed information for each of these areas. And we've tried to be as transparent as possible and as making it as openly and easily accessible as possible. But this is the most important point, because we're not doing this as just a scientific endeavor. We want countries to use them. So if anybody here has ideas on how we can better do that, please do come and see me, and we'll try and do that the best way we can, because we want these areas to be used.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please, Becky.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the panelists, really interesting talks. So I was just thinking, and not sure if it will make sense or not, but the impacts of habitat degradation obviously are quite nuanced for different species, but is there kind of a way that you could think about it more holistically? And if you have a good understanding of habitat degradation levels in a certain area, how much can you use that information to get a better understanding of different species that are living in that same area. So just kind of a question on how much that information could be used more widely, really.
I can probably talk about eels, but I should have probably said earlier that actually when you're thinking about habitat quality, we have certainly made non-detriment findings for species such as snakes based on pristine habitat and extrapolation for limited offtake. And yeah, going back to degradation, the eel management plans do try and account for degradation, but as I said, it's very difficult with different habitats and the amount of barriers that are in place. And I did say I would perhaps talking about Loch Ness, that is a place where it's been eutrophic, and at one stage it was thought that that might actually be of benefit to the eels, but now it's become sort of hyper eutrophic and it's not in a great condition. There are also invasive species such as roach and zebra mussels that are those sort of degradations are going to be accounted for when we perhaps look at the non-detriment finding for Loch Ness. But yeah, I don't know if others can think about what to do about degradation, but really, yeah, really good point.
Yeah, just want to add from Jules that, yeah, the different thing about habitat degradation in the ocean is actually they are connected each other. Pollution in one place will impact other places. It's perhaps rather different in the terrestrial area. And another thing is that habitat degradation often due to anthropogenic, due to human activities. But we also have to consider about this, the climate change. It's always a part of our concern that climate change is real and it's in the ocean. It can also considered as the habitat degradation, in particular for the corals. They bleach, and once the coral bleeds, the other species will also impacted. And yeah, again, the ocean is interconnected each other, and there's no barrier in the ocean. Thank you.
Can I add?
Please.
I know how much you all love the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. I don't know if you've heard of the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems. And that is something that is growing in terms of looking at habitats around the world, primarily coastal habitats for now, and looking at the level of habitat degradation over, again, a certain time frame. So it's expanding very quickly. They finished a few regions of the world, but that's also going to be a tool available to try and assess if certain habitats are critically endangered, vulnerable, and so on. So an important tool, but like they were saying, baselines are rare in many instances, and it becomes very difficult to assess. And it becomes harder when you also have riverine systems or estuaries, because you may, I'll give an example, some sharks and rays go into river systems, and you may have an area that you've identified as being important, and you can try and protect that area, but you also have the whole river system, thousands of kilometers, that is being polluted, that is being exploited, and all of that is adding additional pressure to those habitats that are there. So climate is another one, as he mentioned. We're slowly learning about the impact of climate on species, but for sharks and rays, we're seeing changes in reproduction, calcification, and shifts, distribution shifts. So lots of unknowns. We're slowly finding out about them, but yeah, very important things to consider, and often right now we're using modeling to try and understand what that might mean for the areas that we think are important.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's any final takers.
Thank you, Jack. I want to share my view, especially for Dr. Rima. It is in the many species of shark listed in CITES Appendix 2. So group IUCN for specialists shark and ray become a famous people in our country, because many people live, especially for small-scale fisheries, is very different livelihood to the shark fishing. So until now, I still thinking how I can to inform through our PISA after decision proposal 32 and proposal 33, because the export quota 0. It's just still what we informed of our PISA. And in the other side, like the Pa Ahmad in the presentation, government of Indonesia is very committed to protect the the marine area. We have target to protect 30% for our marine become a marine conservation area. We have large management MPA for protect the marine mammal. We also have the big marine protect area to protect the habitat whale shark. But we don't have enough information if we decide with the critical habitat for species A, species B, species G. So many species of shark, more than 200 species of shark in Ray. It's not possible for us to one MPA for shark species A, one MPA for shark species B. If the shark species group have enough information, give information to us. I want to say, our government is very committed to protect the habitat, critical habitat in our marines. But still, balancing between the, healthy environment, healthy animal, and also healthy people. Without the economic aspect, also difficult for the government to get money to do mini conservation effort. So I think you can respond or no, but I just share our view about the result of the CITES COP, especially for shark and ray. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And yes, Indonesia is in a difficult situation with challenge. Yes, one, you're the largest shark fishery in the world. Two, you have so many islands and so many different people that are fully dependent on fisheries as their source of protein. And I recognize that there are decisions that are being made in many of these fora that are directly going to impact livelihoods potentially. And I think it's not just about MPAs, we're talking about MPAs here, but there are other tools that can be used to try and protect certain habitats. If it's a question of MPAs, there are the important marine mammal areas, there are other tools that are available where as a government you could potentially overlay the information and look at where are the areas where you have your biggest biodiversity and trying to prioritize protecting some of those areas, because like you say, there's so many different species, and if you were to look at each species individually, you're going to have to close off all of your waters. So there are other ways of looking at it. There are also fisheries management tools and actions that can be taken and put in place. They can be seasonal, they can be at different depths. So I think it's about looking at the menu of options that are available depending on the capacity and the needs of your country, and every country is going to be completely different. I know that Indonesia has worked extremely hard with capacity building for identification of species in the trade, trying to do the non-detriment findings and so on. I've been very much involved with RECAM and have visited many times to try and support with that. And I think if there is a need for support with marine spatial planning and anything like that, we'd be happy to help.
Thank you. We are sadly coming to a close now. We've covered quite a lot of ground. A huge thank you again to our speakers. I'm going to try and summarize some of the key takeaways. There's quite a lot, so please jump in and correct me. And then I will turn back to our panel just for any final thoughts that they might want to give. So why does habitat matter? So we've heard that it's a fundamental consideration for species conservation, and that is throughout the entire policy and management process. So whether it's upstream and protecting habitats and the kind of spillover benefits for CITES listed species, or whether it's more specifically within CITES processes themselves, so listing proposals, NDFs, informing all of those processes, it's effectively integral. But we heard there's a lot of challenges in considering it, so I'm not going to list all of them, but we heard about the availability of data, the capacity to be able to actually analyze that data, difficulty around uncertain baselines, how do we account for spatio-temporal changes, climate change, habitat changing over time from anthropogenic pressures, How do we find that balance of accounting for livelihoods and working across sectors? And then always a fun one, jurisdictional issues. And we also heard about the challenges of accounting for individual species, species nuance, and how do you take a kind of an ecosystem-based approach. But we did hear some answers and some sources for hope. So in terms of methods and tools and how we could go about doing this, we heard obviously about ISRAs, which are a really, really quality source of information for parties. We heard about marine spatial planning tools, things like the IUCN Red List of ecosystems, the opportunity to build on and utilize available data that's already existing from other organizations, so whether that's fisheries management organization, CMS, other things like that. And then we also heard that sometimes you're not going to be able to get the data, so applying proxies, using the precautionary approach, and trying to take more of a holistic ecosystem-based approach. Is that a fair summary? Okay. Can I just turn back to the panel? Does anyone want to give a kind of final closing thought? And I guess maybe thinking about, once everyone leaves this room and flies off back home, what might be a kind of a next helpful step in terms of considering this issue further within CITES?
I don't know if I have closing thoughts, but thank you for bringing the discussion on habitats into this conversation. I think it's something that's really important and that's been missing for a very long time. And I know there's the NDF tool that is available that Blue Resources Trust developed that I believe now is going to be housed on the CITES website, and we are talking to them in terms of also trying to put the ISRA information in there so that when NDFs are being developed, they can also use that as a source of information. But yeah, thank you for bringing this conversation here.
I'm not sure I've got any thoughts at all, actually, after 2 weeks. But yeah, following on from Rima, I would say, would urge parties to sort of publish NDFs. They're really useful, and yeah, use the ENDF tool, and also use the guidance that was produced. I mean, it's a very boring sort of summary, but safe travels.
Yeah, talking about NDF, I think the guideline is already there. We just need to follow, but maybe I don't know if it's useful if we also integrate the habitat consideration through a kind of modeling in that NDF. Like, what will be the status of this species in the next 10 years if we are using this model of utilization, let's say so, or the second and the third modeling. I think modeling will inform us the future utilization of the CITES listed species. Thank you.
Thank you. So just one final thanks again to the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries and to Rekam for making this happen. And a huge thanks to our speakers once again. Can we give them one last round of applause? You can go.